Just to set the scene for some of the conversation that we'll have up here, I think one of the things that's, coming across loud and clear through the course of today's presentations, every market within every region is at different stages of maturity. What that does is it means there are different business priorities, different enterprise and consumer pressures, different socioeconomic ambitions in each of those different markets. But there are some common threads and themes that run across them. And that's what we'll seek to examine in this upcoming panel conversation, where we look at some of the existing success stories, but also some of the strategies which can drive forward broadband industry development. I'd like to introduce on the stage to join me for the panel my colleagues Sunil, Daniel and Vishesh. Thank you everybody for joining us on stage here today. I think let's start with a round of introductions. If I can just also say for those in the audience, we are going to welcome questions throughout the course of today's discussion. So please do raise your hand and one of my colleagues will bring across a microphone if you have a comment to make or a question to pose to one of our panelists. But maybe in the course of starting those introductions, Daniel, if we start at your end of the row.
My name is Daniel Tang. I'm from Huawei's data communication product line. I look after the technology strategies for data communication network. Because as we all know, people need ultra broadband to deliver high-speed internet. So on top of the physical bandwidth, we also need to deliver next generation internet service, particularly based on IPv6 protocols.
Thank you, Daniel. Vishesh, if I pass to you.
My name is Vishesh Gupta. I'm not as technically evolved as most of my panelists, but I'm from the banking community. So I sort of run the Asia TMT healthcare and consumer sector banking business for SMBC, based out of Singapore. Have been predominantly a TMT banker throughout my career, and what we do is effectively sort of help finance some of the asset classes we've been talking about. And obviously sort of, the finance looks at both the debt and the equity elements of it.
Thanks, Vishesh. And Sunil, for anybody who's joined us since your presentation, do you want to reintroduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Sunil Pyarlao from OpenServe South Africa. OpenServe is a wholesale open access network services provider, and I'm an executive responsible for the network architecture and modeling. But I'll try and avoid any technical jargon. I'll try and keep it without technical proficiency.
Let's see if we can hold you to that. I think what you'll see here across, of course, is that we've got a range of backgrounds and perspectives. Hopefully that will bring to the panel, from the investment community, vendor and also operator community. I think just to get us started, just to kind of bring to the surface one of the macro trends that we've been discussing across the course of this afternoon, this fact that connectivity is the absolutely critical driving force for the digital economy, and connectivity for all is the ultimate ambition. What does that mean in terms of driving regional development? I wonder if anybody wants to get us started there.
Sure. So I think, the way at least I look at it, and especially I think the world has changed pretty much pre the pandemic and post the pandemic, right? There were a lot of advanced use cases which were under development, sort of autonomous vehicles, connected machines, and so on and so forth. But the way I see this is, the most basic requirements of education, doing your daily jobs, they have to a large extent, or at least to some extent, moved online, right? Any organization that we see, and I know I'm making a very broad generalization, but to a large degree, people are actually spending a lot of time working from home or working remotely. And I think, to me, being connected doesn't just stop there. Your healthcare services, right? This is all sort of the basics and the essentials. Again, we can go into the more futuristic sort of use cases as well. But I think where Asia is, at least the basics being addressed is what probably will drive a lot of the near-term acceleration in demand. And then, things which are a little more evolved will happen, further down the line.
Absolutely. I think COVID certainly made more acute the fact that broadband is part of our critical national infrastructure just for living our daily lives, even without considering the kind of the use cases and applications of the future. When we think about, those increased demands, that's going to put, or is already putting, a lot of pressure on the IP network, which is, a fundamental enabler for our broadband infrastructure. How important is, this concept of IP on everything? Daniel, I wonder if you have a view.
As we discussed earlier, together there are already a lot of people almost live on the internet every day. So I think when we say ultra broadband for everyone,
Yep.
it's also about internet service to everything. But the challenge today is shortage of IP address due to the limitation of IPv4, basically the internet protocol based on version 4.
Yep.
That's why we work together with IETF, the standard organization, to drive the adoption of IPv6 based implementations. Maybe you have seen some very impressive fiber broadband numbers in China, but similarly, even more impressive is the progress of the IPv6 adoption ratio in China has significantly increased from down to less than 10% to more or less 60% at the end of last year. So this is really quite some progress. I think just like government plays a very important role to accelerate adoption of fiber, the adoption of IPv6 also needs a lot of regulation initiative
Yep.
to drive things forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think where we see the government take the lead from a policy perspective, the industry in that territory then gets behind and adopts more quickly the IPv6 protocol.
Yes, and also I think, of course, the government's own IT spending is also very important here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that might be a topic that we come back to later on in the
Okay.
conversation.
Yes.
If you think about broadband specifically, how do we feel like we're progressing as an industry towards this concept of ubiquitous broadband? We've seen lots of data points in terms of connectivity trends. I mean, Sunil, I'll start with you because you showed that very fascinating map of how far the light spreads across the African continent. If you take a kind of a global view, how do you think we're doing in that progress towards ubiquitous broadband?
Yeah, ubiquitous broadband is an interesting subject, Mark. We have ubiquity. We definitely have ubiquity, but where do we have it? We have it where the telcos can get the highest ARPU, where you can get the best return on investment. So we have ubiquity in metropolitan areas. And as you move out of the metropolitan, I think ubiquity disappears totally. I used the concept of light earlier on to demonstrate omnipresence.
Yep.
And I think it's not just about connectivity, it's access to internet, access to not just fiber, but access to any form of broadband connectivity is non-existent in many rural parts, many suburban parts. Where Daniel and I were talking earlier on as well. He's got some interesting stats across the world where people don't have access to basic connectivity.
Yep.
So talking about ubiquity, yes, it does exist, but it does not exist all over. It exists in metropolitan areas where you have many operators overbuilding each other. And again, totally related to return on investment. And we need to look at other funding models, which I'm sure my colleague from the bank will talk about how we can fund the deployment of not just fiber, but deployment of broadband in general.
Okay, good. So let's kind of expand on that now then. So we've got this degree of ubiquity in metro areas, but that is not something which is necessarily nationwide. How do we go about filling that gap? What needs to happen for us to spread the light?
So I think just from a sort of funding standpoint, right? And I think where there's light, that's where the money goes, or it's vice versa as well. What at least I've seen, and again, I'd sort of look at digital infrastructure as one bucket of infrastructure for telecoms, right? There's been a lot of progress on certain sectors. Towers, for an example, was at a place 15 years ago where we were probably having similar conversations, or 20 years ago, right? Again, data centers, although not exactly related, but it forms part of the network and the computing. Again, there's a lot of work being done there. Now, broadband as a service has existed probably for the longest time. I mean, pretty much as in line with when we had sort of wireless. But what I haven't seen, at least in Asia, is real investment going into the parts which were underserved many years ago. Yes, the bucket has sort of increased, but you'd be surprised, amongst the most developed nations in Asia, there are still pockets where there's no broadband connectivity. It's just the terrain, and it's where the houses are, and the density. I think, again, this is a very difficult question to answer, because there's no sort of magic around it. But ultimately, I think, to me, the biggest thing here is that we've got to start looking at broadband-based returns from a slightly broader angle. It cannot just be, that ARPU that you get from the X subscribers that you get from that part of the world or that part of a specific country. That may not work in areas with low population density and where the affordability is not really there. Yeah. I think it has to be looked at as a combination of what can be achieved from that internet. I recall sort of, Martin pointed out to some of the stats there. To me, the unconnected, we need to see what happens when they're connected and what's the value that can be generated out of it. If it's just about that X number of subscribers on that Y ARPU,